Chapter 1. The Whisper Beneath the Dust. Snow fell gently outside the attic window, each flake an intricate masterpiece dissolving against the frosted glass. Margaret Wells stood amid the forgotten relics of her late grandmother's home, the air thick with the scent of aged wood and time-worn paper. The attic had always been a place of mystery in her childhood, its low beams and dusty trunks brimming with the promise of stories long untold. Now, it was simply another task, one of many she had taken on since inheriting the old New England house nestled in the heart of Garland Cove. The small town was as picturesque as ever, its streets draped in twinkling lights, the sound of carolers faintly reaching her ears even from here. But Margaret's heart felt heavy as she sifted through the remnants of another era, her gloved hands brushing aside cobwebs and lifting the lids of old boxes. Each item was a thread of her grandmother's life. Yellowed photographs, brittle letters tied with string, and embroidered linens that spoke of hands that had worked with care. She had been at this for hours, her breath visible in the chilly attic air. The estate's sale loomed ahead, and she knew she couldn't keep everything. Still, the process was painstaking. Every object seemed to carry the weight of history, whispering tales she longed to hear but had no time to understand. As the daylight waned, her gloved hand grazed the corner of an unassuming wooden box, half buried beneath a quilt. It was smaller than the rest, almost unnoticeable, its surface dulled with age but still sturdy. She hesitated, her fingers tracing the delicate carvings along its edges. Something about it seemed out of place, as though it didn't belong with the other, more practical belongings. With a small effort, she pulled it free and settled onto an old armchair, the worn upholstery sighing beneath her weight. The box's latch creaked as she lifted it, and the hinges gave way to reveal its contents. A neatly folded stack of parchment, its topmost page bearing the faint outline of ink. It wasn't just any ink. It swirled in elegant, deliberate strokes, spelling out words that seemed to hold their breath within the confines of the box. Margaret's brow furrowed as she carefully lifted the letter, its edges brittle but intact. The handwriting was beautiful, each loop and curve imbued with an almost tender care. The ink had faded over time, but the words remained legible. My dearest, though years have passed since our last meeting, not a day has gone by that I have not thought of you. Her breath caught as she read on, her eyes scanning the lines that followed. The letter spoke of a love so deeply felt it transcended the limits of time and space, its tone both hopeful and aching. The writer's identity was unknown, as was the recipient's, but the emotion was unmistakable. Each word seemed to pulse with life, as though the paper itself had absorbed the passion of its author. Margaret's mind raced. Who had written this letter, and why had it been hidden here, among the forgotten artifacts of her grandmother's life? She glanced back at the box, noting more folded sheets beneath the first. Carefully, she set the letter aside and reached for the next, her heart beating faster with each passing moment. As she unfolded the second letter, a name caught her eye, Eleanor. Her grandmother's name. But the letter wasn't addressed to her grandmother. It was addressed from her. The room seemed to shift as Margaret's thoughts collided, her understanding of her grandmother's life suddenly thrown into question. She had known Eleanor Wells as a woman of tradition, steady and grounded, a pillar of the community. Yet here, in her trembling hands, lay evidence of a hidden story, a chapter of her grandmother's life she had never imagined. The snow outside the window thickened, the world beyond growing dim as the attic seemed to hold its breath. The letters, their fragile edges cradled in Margaret's hands, were a portal to a past she had never known existed. Questions swirled in her mind, each one louder than the last. Who was the recipient of these heartfelt words? And why had they been kept secret for so long? The weight of the discovery pressed upon her, and yet, beneath it, She felt a flicker of something unexpected, a curiosity, a pull to uncover the truth hidden within these delicate pages. As the final traces of daylight surrendered to the winter night, Margaret knew one thing for certain. The story behind these letters would not remain silent any longer. Chapter 2. Echoes in the Paper. The attic's quiet deepened as the winter evening encased Garland Cove in its snowy embrace. Margaret sat in the growing dimness, the letters resting on her lap like a fragile treasure unearthed from another world. Her breath misted the chilled air as she turned the letters over in her mind, the words she had read still echoing like distant bells. There was no mistaking her grandmother's elegant script, the same hand that had signed birthday cards and scrawled recipes on the back of envelopes. Yet these words were far removed from the Eleanor Wells she thought she knew. Margaret reached for the next letter in the box, the paper brittle beneath her touch. The handwriting flowed effortlessly, a river of thought and feeling that seemed both intimate and urgent. It began with the same tender salutation as the first, "My dearest." The letter spoke of fleeting moments, secret meetings beneath the canopy of a summer sky, and promises whispered under the stars. It painted a picture of a love that was vibrant and daring, yet shadowed by a sense of inevitability, as though the writer had known their time together was destined to be finite. Each sentence carried the weight of longing, a yearning that seemed to stretch beyond the confines of time. Margaret's pulse quickened as she read. The letters revealed a part of her grandmother that was unrecognizable, romantic, poetic, and passionate. She tried to reconcile this version of Eleanor with the woman she had grown up with, who had always been steady and reserved, her affection expressed through quiet actions rather than grand declarations. This Eleanor, the one who had poured her heart onto these pages, was a stranger. Her eyes returned to the letters in the box, their edges yellowed but intact, as though preserved by the very weight of the secrets they carried. Margaret began to piece together fragments of the story, gleaned from the letters' vivid descriptions. The recipient, though unnamed, was clearly someone Eleanor had loved deeply. The letters hinted at meetings on the outskirts of Garland Cove, under the shelter of an old willow tree by the frozen lake. It was there, the writer claimed, that their bond had grown, nurtured by stolen moments away from the eyes of the world. Margaret's gaze drifted to the attic window, where the snow now fell in thick, quiet sheets, covering the landscape below. She could picture it clearly: the lake, the willow tree, the two figures hidden in the embrace of winter. But why had Eleanor kept these letters hidden all these years? And why had she written them if they were never meant to be sent? Margaret shook herself from her thoughts and reached for the final sheet of the day's discovery. Unlike the others, this letter bore a date, December 15th, 1947. It was the only clue to the time of this romance, placing it years before her grandmother's marriage to the man Margaret had known as her grandfather. The letter was shorter, almost abrupt, yet no less heartfelt. It spoke of sacrifice, of decisions made in the name of duty rather than desire. The writer's pain was palpable, the words imbued with sorrow and acceptance. "Though my heart will never forget, I must let go," the letter read. "For your happiness and mine, I must say goodbye." Margaret felt a pang of grief as she read the final words, the emotions transcending the decades that separated her from their author. Eleanor's love, though vivid and alive on these pages, had been left behind, preserved only in the sanctuary of this attic. The snow outside deepened into darkness as Margaret gently replaced the letters in the box, her mind swirling with possibilities. She knew she couldn't leave this mystery unresolved. Someone, somewhere, had been the recipient of these letters. Someone had shared this love with Eleanor, and someone had remained silent about it for decades. Her thoughts turned to Garland Cove's history, its winding streets lined with homes that had stood for generations. Somewhere within this town, a piece of the puzzle might remain. A name, a photograph, a memory passed down in whispers. And there was one person who might know where to start. Margaret's lips tightened as she thought of Samuel Treadwell, the town's self-proclaimed historian. He had grown up in Garland Cove, just as she had, but their interactions had always been sharp-edged, their personalities clashing in ways that often left them both bristling. Yet, if anyone could help her unearth the story behind these letters, it would be him. The idea of working with Samuel filled her with a reluctant anticipation. She could already hear his smug remarks, see the flicker of amusement in his eyes as he inevitably found a way to make the search about his own brilliance. But for now, her determination outweighed her hesitation. Margaret carefully closed the box and rose from the armchair, the attic creaking beneath her feet. The letters had spoken, their whispers threading through the silence of her grandmother's home. Tomorrow, she would begin her search for answers, for the truth behind the love that had been tucked away in this attic, waiting for its story to be told. Chapter 3: Threads of Time. Morning light seeped through the frost-laced windows of the Wells home, painting the hardwood floors in muted gold. The snow that had fallen overnight lay undisturbed, a pristine blanket across the yard and garden, softening the edges of the world. Inside, Margaret stood at the kitchen counter, her fingers wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. Her eyes lingered on the box of letters she had brought down from the attic, now resting on the table as though it held the answers to every question racing through her mind. The previous night's revelations had left her restless, her dreams punctuated by fleeting images of her grandmother, shadowy figures beneath a willow tree, and words dissolving into snow. Margaret felt as though she had stumbled upon a loose thread in the fabric of her family's history, one that threatened to unravel a story she had never known existed. She set the mug down and ran a finger along the edge of the box. The letters were delicate, their secrets carefully preserved over decades, but they were incomplete. She needed more: a name, a connection, a clue that would tether the words to someone real. Her mind returned to Samuel Treadwell, the historian whose name seemed inseparable from Garland Cove's past. If anyone could provide a map to navigate this labyrinth of memories, it would be him. She couldn't avoid him forever, not if she truly wanted to uncover the story behind these letters. The morning air was biting as Margaret stepped outside, the cold wrapping around her in sharp contrast to the stillness of the house. The streets of Garland Cove were beginning to stir, chimneys puffing out lazy trails of smoke as the town woke to another winter's day. Wreaths adorned doorways, and garlands stretched between street lamps, the entire scene like something plucked from an old Christmas card. Margaret pulled her coat tighter and set off toward the library, a stately brick building at the heart of the town. Its arched windows gleamed with the reflection of snow-covered trees, and its steep roof held a crown of icicles that glittered in the pale sunlight. It was a place steeped in tradition, much like the man she hoped to find there. Inside, the warmth of the library enveloped her, the air tinged with the scent of aged books and polished wood. Shelves stretched to the ceiling, their spines a kaleidoscope of colors and textures, while the hushed murmur of pages turning provided a soothing rhythm. And there he was, seated at a long oak table near the stained glass window depicting Garland Cove's founding. Samuel Treadwell, with his ever-present air of confidence and the faintest hint of mischief in his expression, was poring over a ledger, his pen moving steadily across the page. Margaret hesitated at the threshold of the room. It had been years since they'd last spoken, years since their school days, when their debates over history assignments had drawn both laughter and exasperation from their teachers. Time had softened some of the sharpness she associated with him, though not entirely. His presence still carried the unmistakable weight of someone who enjoyed being right. She moved toward him, her boots clicking softly against the polished floor. As she neared, Samuel glanced up, his sharp blue eyes narrowing slightly in recognition. His expression flickered with surprise before settling into something unreadable. Margaret didn't wait for pleasantries. Instead, she placed the box of letters on the table with a deliberate motion, the wood thudding softly against the surface. Samuel raised an eyebrow, his gaze shifting to the box, then back to her. The questions that danced in his eyes were mirrored in her own, though she gave him no time to voice them. Instead, she took a seat across from him, her movements as deliberate as her placement of the box. For a moment, the two of them sat in silence, the letters resting between them like a bridge and a barrier all at once. Samuel's fingers brushed the edge of the box, his curiosity evident. Margaret watched him carefully, knowing this was the moment she had to set aside their history, their rivalry, and let him into this fragile mystery she had uncovered. As Samuel reached for the first letter, Margaret felt a mix of reluctance and anticipation. The story she had begun to piece together was no longer hers alone. Together, they would follow the threads of time, unraveling a love story that had been hidden for decades. Chapter 4: The Keeper of Secrets. The library seemed to hold its breath as Samuel lifted the first letter from the box. His fingers, long and deliberate, handled the paper with the care of someone accustomed to unraveling history's delicate layers. Margaret sat motionless across from him, her eyes fixed on the letter as though it might reveal its secrets through sheer will. The room was quiet save for the faint rustle of parchment. Snow tapped lightly against the stained glass window, its delicate rhythm an echo of Margaret's own heartbeat. She felt the weight of expectation pressing against her as Samuel's eyes scanned the letter. His expression, calm and measured, betrayed nothing. At last, he leaned back in his chair, holding the letter between his thumb and forefinger as though it were a piece of evidence in some grand investigation. His gaze lifted to hers, thoughtful and piercing. Margaret braced herself for whatever observations would follow, her mind already imagining his smug tone. But instead, his voice, low and contemplative, carried none of its usual sharpness. "This is extraordinary." The words, though simple, felt like a small victory. Margaret's shoulders eased slightly as Samuel set the letter down and reached for another. His movements were efficient yet reverent, his focus unbroken. He read through the second letter, then the third, his brow furrowing with concentration. Margaret let her own thoughts wander as she watched him. The sight of Samuel, so intent and absorbed, brought back memories of their school days, when he had always been the first to raise his hand in history class, eager to correct a misstep or expand on a point. Back then, she had found his confidence grating, his ability to know the answers infuriatingly precise. Yet now, she found herself grateful for those same qualities. Samuel was, for all his flaws, a man who understood the significance of the past. He wasn't just reading these letters, he was absorbing them, fitting them into a larger puzzle in his mind. When he finally spoke again, his tone was measured but laced with intrigue. These letters were never meant to be read by anyone but the recipient. The language is too personal, too vulnerable. Your grandmother must have poured her heart into them. But why were they left unsent? The question hung in the air, heavy with possibility. Margaret shook her head. "I don't know. I found them hidden in the attic, tucked away as if she meant to keep them safe but unseen. The dates are from the late 1940s, years before she married my grandfather." Samuel's lips pressed into a thin line, his gaze drifting back to the letters. If she intended for these letters to be private, then the fact that they exist at all is telling. They meant something to her. Something important enough to preserve, but too painful to share. Margaret felt a pang of sadness at his words. She had known her grandmother as a woman of quiet strength, someone who rarely spoke of her own struggles or desires. To think that Eleanor had carried such a profound story in silence was both humbling and heartbreaking. Samuel reached for the box, his fingers brushing against its carved edges. "Have you noticed this?" he asked, tilting the box to catch the light. Margaret leaned closer, her eyes following his gesture. There, along the bottom of the box, was a faint engraving, barely visible beneath years of wear. It was a name, Avery. The name sent a shiver through Margaret, though she couldn't say why. She had never heard of anyone named Avery in her grandmother's life, yet the engraving seemed significant. Samuel tapped the box thoughtfully, his expression sharpening with interest. "This could be our first clue," he said. "Avery might be the recipient, or perhaps someone connected to the letters in another way. Either way, it's a lead worth following." Margaret nodded, her curiosity swelling despite the uncertainty. The name felt like a thread dangling before her, begging to be pulled. Samuel leaned forward, his eyes glinting with determination. "There are records in the town archives, property deeds, census lists, old photographs. If this Avery lived in Garland Cove, we might find something there." The thought of diving into the archives filled Margaret with equal parts excitement and apprehension. She had always loved history, but the idea of uncovering something so personal, so intertwined with her family, was daunting. Still, the thought of leaving the letter's story unfinished was unthinkable. As they prepared to leave the library, Margaret glanced back at the box of letters, now closed but no less alive with mystery. The name Avery lingered in her mind, a whisper from the past that refused to fade. The snow outside had thickened. The streets of Garland Cove hushed under its weight. Margaret and Samuel walked side by side, their footsteps crunching softly against the frozen ground. The town seemed smaller in the quiet of winter, its secrets tucked away beneath layers of time. For the first time, Margaret felt the stirrings of something unexpected, a connection not only to the story she sought to uncover, but also to the man walking beside her. Chapter 5. Frosted Memories. The archives of Garland Cove were housed in the basement of the library, a labyrinth of wooden filing cabinets, brittle papers, and books so old their spines were held together with delicate care. The air smelled of aged ink and parchment, mingled with the faint chill of stone walls that had weathered centuries. Margaret stood at the bottom of the narrow staircase, staring into the dimly lit room where the past seemed to breathe in whispers. Beside her, Samuel moved with purpose. He carried a notebook and a small penlight, tools of someone accustomed to navigating the forgotten corners of history. His enthusiasm, though restrained, was palpable, as if the scent of an unsolved mystery invigorated him. Margaret trailed after him, feeling the weight of the task ahead. Rows of cabinets lined the walls, each drawer meticulously labeled with dates and topics. Property records, 1900 to 1950, births and marriages, 1850 to 1925, town correspondence. Samuel began immediately, scanning labels with the sharp eye of someone who had spent countless hours here. "You'll start with surnames," he said, breaking the quiet. "If Avery was a resident, the census records should point us in the right direction. I'll take property deeds, names, transfers, anything that might tie the name to a location." Margaret nodded, brushing aside a lingering unease. Despite her apprehension about working alongside Samuel, she couldn't deny his expertise. Together, they divided the task, and Margaret found herself seated at a low table with a stack of census records from the 1940s. The pages crackled as she turned them, the faint imprint of typewriter ink making her feel as though she were reading ghostly echoes of lives long past. She worked methodically, her finger tracing columns of names. The surname Avery did not appear with the frequency she had hoped. Garland Cove, though picturesque, had never been a populous town, and many families had left during the post-war years in search of opportunity. Still, she persisted, determined to unearth something, anything, that might lead to the answers she sought. Samuel worked silently across the room, his penlight illuminating lines of text as he flipped through fragile pages. His concentration was unbroken, and Margaret found herself stealing occasional glances at him. There was a steadiness to his movements, a confidence that seemed to dissolve the competitive edges of their shared history. Hours passed, marked only by the muted chime of the library's clock and the faint whistle of wind against the windows. Margaret felt her resolve waver as page after page revealed no mention of Avery. Frustration mounted, but she forced herself to continue, her determination stronger than her weariness. Then, finally, a breakthrough. In a census record from 1946, Margaret found it, a name listed among the residents of Garland Cove, Avery Townsend. The name sent a jolt through her, its sudden presence like a light piercing the fog. Townsend was an old name in Garland Cove, one that conjured images of sprawling estates and long-forgotten fortunes. She read further, her eyes scanning the details. Avery Townsend had been listed as residing at Willowmere House, a once grand Victorian estate on the outskirts of town. The house, abandoned for decades, had fallen into disrepair, its empty halls whispered about by townsfolk as though the walls themselves held secrets. Margaret quickly jotted down the details, her pen moving feverishly. She felt a spark of excitement, the kind that comes with the first tangible clue in a mystery. Across the room, Samuel straightened, as though sensing her discovery. "What did you find?" he asked, his voice cutting through the stillness. Margaret held up the census record, her expression triumphant. Avery Townsend. He lived at Willowmere House in 1946. Samuel's eyebrows rose slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. Willowmere, he murmured, as though the name carried weight in his own memories. He set aside the documents he had been studying and moved to stand beside her, his presence bringing with it a mixture of validation and anticipation. Together, they examined the record. Samuel's finger traced the name as though committing it to memory. "Avery Townsend," he repeated softly, "a name tied to wealth, history, and controversy." Margaret glanced at him, curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Samuel folded his arms, leaning against the table. The Townsend family was one of Garland Cove's wealthiest in the early 20th century. They owned much of the land on the outskirts of town, including the lumber mill and several of the larger farms. But by the 1940s, their fortune had begun to dwindle. Willowmere House was one of the last remnants of their legacy. Margaret absorbed the information, her thoughts turning to the letters. If Avery Townsend had been the recipient, what connection could he have had with her grandmother, a woman whose life had seemed so far removed from the world of the Townsends? Samuel's gaze sharpened. "We'll need to visit Willowmere," he said decisively. "If there are records or personal belongings left behind, they might give us more context." The thought of visiting the estate filled Margaret with a strange mix of excitement and apprehension. Willowmere House had always loomed in her mind as a place of shadows and whispers, its imposing silhouette visible from the far end of town. She remembered stories of broken windows and ivy-covered walls, a place abandoned not just by its owners but by time itself. But now, it was a destination, a place that might hold the answers to the questions burning in her mind. Margaret gathered her notes, her resolve hardening. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, though much remained uncertain. As she and Samuel climbed the stairs back to the library's main floor, the weight of discovery pressed upon her. Beneath the layers of dust and decay, the truth waited to be uncovered. Chapter 6. The Hidden Script. The road to Willowmere House wound through the outskirts of Garland Cove, flanked by snow-draped trees and skeletal branches that reached skyward like specters frozen in time. Margaret and Samuel traveled in silence, the hum of the car engine the only sound as they approached the estate. The sense of purpose that had driven them through the archives lingered, tempered now by the unease of what they might uncover. The estate emerged through the trees, its outline stark against the muted gray sky. Willowmere House was a shadow of its former self, its grandeur faded but not entirely erased. The once pristine Victorian architecture was now cloaked in ivy, its pointed gables and ornate trim worn by decades of neglect. Shattered windows stared out like vacant eyes, and the roof sagged under the weight of time and snow. Margaret hesitated as Samuel parked the car. The air was sharp with cold, her breath visible as she exhaled. There was an aura about the house, an undeniable weight that seemed to settle on her chest as she stepped onto the snow-crusted driveway. The estate felt alive with memory, its silence deafening in its intensity. Samuel led the way, his stride purposeful as he approached the main door. Margaret followed, her boots crunching against the snow. The entrance was grand yet foreboding, the double doors warped and peeling, their iron handles rusted but still solid. Samuel pushed one door open with a creak, revealing a darkened interior. Inside, the air was damp and heavy, tinged with the scent of mildew and decay. Dust hung in the air like a fine mist, disturbed only by their movement. The grand staircase, once a centerpiece of elegance, was draped in cobwebs, its banister chipped and splintered. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, revealing patches of bare wood beneath. Margaret shivered, not entirely from the cold. The house felt like a mausoleum for forgotten stories, its rooms holding the remnants of lives that had long since departed. Samuel's flashlight cut through the gloom, its beams sweeping across the floor and up the staircase. "We should start in the study," he said, his voice low but steady. "If the Townsends left anything behind, it's likely to be there." Margaret nodded, her unease mingling with anticipation. Together, they moved deeper into the house, their footsteps echoing softly against the floorboards. The study was at the far end of the hallway, its door slightly ajar as though inviting them in. The room was a snapshot of another era, its furnishings untouched by modernity. A massive oak desk dominated the space, its surface cluttered with yellowed papers and an old ink bottle. Shelves lined the walls, their contents a mix of books, ledgers, and trinkets now coated in dust. Heavy curtains hung limply over the windows, their fabric faded and brittle. Margaret moved toward the desk, her fingers brushing against the papers. Most were unremarkable: receipts, correspondence, and notes written in a neat but formal hand. Still, she sifted through them with care, searching for anything that might connect to Avery Townsend. Samuel, meanwhile, focused on the bookshelves, his flashlight illuminating titles and spines worn smooth by time. His movements were deliberate, each book examined briefly before being set aside. Minutes stretched into an hour as they combed through the study's contents. Frustration began to creep in as Margaret found nothing of significance. She was beginning to doubt the connection when her fingers brushed against something beneath a stack of papers, a small, leather-bound journal. She pulled it free, her breath catching as she opened the cover. The pages were filled with elegant handwriting, the ink faded but legible. At the top of the first page, a name was scrawled in delicate script: Avery Townsend. "Samuel," she said, her voice tight with urgency. He turned immediately, his eyes narrowing as she held up the journal. Without a word, he crossed the room and took it from her hands, his expression shifting to one of keen interest. He flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing as he read. "This could be exactly what we need," he said, his tone laced with excitement. "It's personal, a diary, by the looks of it. If Avery wrote about his life here, it might give us the context we're missing." Margaret watched as Samuel scanned the entries, his eyes darting across the words. Her own curiosity burned, but she resisted the urge to snatch the journal back. Instead, she busied herself with examining the desk drawers, hoping to find something that might complement the diary's revelations. In one drawer, she found a small bundle of photographs, their edges curled and their images faded. The photographs depicted scenes of life at Willowmere, elegant gatherings, candid moments, and a man she assumed to be Avery. His features were sharp and refined, his expression both solemn and enigmatic. Margaret stared at one photograph in particular. Avery standing on the estate's front steps, a letter clutched in his hand. The image was haunting in its simplicity, as though the letter itself held some great importance. Samuel's voice broke the silence. "There's something here," he said, holding up the journal. "Mentions of someone, E, he calls her. The entries are vague, but it's clear she meant a great deal to him." Margaret's heart quickened. Her grandmother's name was Eleanor. Could it be possible? She handed the photograph to Samuel, her hand trembling slightly. "Look at this," she said. "Avery with a letter." Samuel examined the photograph, his expression darkening with thought. "It's not definitive, but it's a start," he said. "If this E was Eleanor, we're closer to understanding the connection." Margaret felt a swell of determination. The journal, the photograph, they were pieces of a puzzle that was beginning to take shape. But the picture was far from complete, and questions still loomed. Who was Avery Townsend to her grandmother? And why had their story been buried beneath the ruins of time? As they left Willowmere House, the journal clutched tightly in Samuel's hand. Margaret felt the weight of the past pressing against her. The answers lay ahead, but so too did the shadows of what those answers might reveal. Chapter 7. Winter's Silent Witness. The journal sat between Margaret and Samuel on the small cafe table, its weathered leather cover imbued with the weight of history. Outside, Garland Cove bustled softly, the falling snow blanketing the town in a hushed stillness. Yet within the cafe, time seemed suspended. Margaret stared at the journal, her fingers resting lightly on its edge, as if touching it too firmly might disturb the fragile secrets it contained. Samuel had suggested they meet here, away from the cold emptiness of Willowmere and the distractions of the library. The warmth of the cafe, with its crackling fireplace and the scent of cinnamon lingering in the air, seemed at odds with the intensity of their task. But it was also grounding, a reminder that the present held its own comforts even as they delved into the shadows of the past. Margaret opened the journal to its first entry. The handwriting was elegant and deliberate, each word penned with care. Avery Townsend had begun his diary in the summer of 1946, his voice resonating through the decades with an intimacy that felt almost intrusive. June 14th, 1946. The house grows quieter with each passing day. Mother insists we must preserve appearances, but even she cannot deny that our world is shrinking. The grand dinners, the servants bustling through the halls, the laughter that once filled these rooms. All are memories now. The estate is fading, as are we. Still, I find solace in the garden, where the roses bloom as if they do not know they are the last of their kind. Margaret read the words aloud, her voice soft but steady. She could feel Avery's melancholy, his awareness of his family's decline woven through his reflections. The image of the garden, vibrant against the decay of the estate, lingered in her mind. Samuel leaned closer, his attention fixed on the journal. "He's poetic," he remarked. "Even in the face of loss, he finds beauty." Margaret nodded, turning the page. The entries unfolded with a rhythm that spoke of a man trying to hold onto something intangible. Hope, perhaps, or the memory of a life slipping away. July 3rd, 1946. Eleanor came to Willowmere today. Her laughter filled the garden, chasing away the stillness that has lingered here for far too long. She is unlike anyone I have ever known. brilliant, unyielding, and utterly captivating. I feel alive in her presence, as though the world has color once more. I am drawn to her in a way I cannot explain, nor do I wish to try. Margaret froze. The name leapt off the page, her breath catching in her throat. Eleanor. There it was, undeniable and vivid. Her grandmother's name, linked now to Avery Townsend in a way she had never imagined. Samuel noticed her reaction, his expression sharpening. Eleanor. That's her, isn't it? Margaret nodded slowly, the truth settling over her like a snowdrift. The grandmother she had known, a quiet, unassuming woman who had loved baking pies and tending to her roses, had once been a young woman who had captivated the heart of a man from a world so different from her own. They continued reading, the journal painting a picture of a relationship that had blossomed amidst the decay of Willowmere. Eleanor's visits were described in detail, her wit, her kindness, and the way she brought life to the estate. Avery's words were laced with admiration, his feelings for her unmistakable. But there were also hints of something deeper, a shadow that lingered at the edges of his entries. August 10th, 1946. Today, Eleanor spoke of leaving Garland Cove. Her ambitions pull her toward a life beyond this town, and I cannot blame her. She deserves the world, even if it means I must let her go. But the thought of her absence is unbearable. I cannot lose her, not now, not when she has become the center of everything I hold dear. Margaret felt a pang of sadness as she read. The vulnerability in Avery's words was palpable, his fear of loss raw and unguarded. She wondered what had happened next. Had Eleanor left? Had their connection faded into memory, or had something else intervened? Samuel leaned back, his brow furrowed in thought. There's more to this story, he said. The letters, the journal. They're pieces of a puzzle, but we're still missing the larger picture. Why didn't they stay together? What happened to Eleanor after this? Margaret didn't have an answer. The journal's entries continued, each one deepening the sense of a love that had been both transformative and fleeting. But as the summer of 1946 waned, Avery's tone grew heavier, his words tinged with an unspoken grief. September 15th, 1946. Eleanor did not come today. I waited in the garden, hoping to hear her laughter one last time. But the silence was absolute. I wrote her a letter, my final attempt to tell her what she means to me. If she reads it, perhaps she will understand. If not, then I shall carry this sorrow quietly, as I have carried so many others. Margaret closed the journal, her heart heavy. The letter, was it the same one she had found in her grandmother's attic? Had Eleanor ever read it? Or had it been tucked away, forgotten and unopened, until decades later? Samuel's voice broke the silence. We need to find out what happened after this. If there are more letters, or anything in the town records, it might fill in the gaps. Margaret nodded, though her thoughts were elsewhere. The image of her grandmother, young and vibrant, entwined with the history of Willowmere and Avery Townsend, was difficult to reconcile with the woman she had known. It was as though she were discovering a stranger hidden within someone she loved. As they left the cafe, the snow continued to fall, muffling the world outside. Margaret clutched the journal to her chest, its weight both literal and symbolic. The answers were out there, buried beneath years of silence and secrecy, and she was determined to uncover them, no matter where the search might lead. Chapter 8. Shadows of a Promise. The wind howled through Garland Cove that morning, carrying with it a biting chill that swept across the snow-covered town. Margaret found herself at the library once again, the journal tucked securely in her satchel as she and Samuel dove into their next line of investigation. The pieces of Avery Townsend's story were beginning to take shape, but they remained incomplete, like a fragmented mosaic yearning for cohesion. The library had always been a sanctuary for Margaret, a place where time, seemed to pause amidst the endless rows of books and the muffled sounds of pages turning. Today, however, the atmosphere felt charged, the weight of their task pressing down on her with palpable urgency. Samuel had already spread a collection of town records across one of the long oak tables. His brow was furrowed in concentration as he sifted through faded documents and brittle pages, his methodical nature a stark contrast to Margaret's more intuitive approach. She sat beside him, her fingers brushing against the journal's worn cover, her mind racing with questions. Eleanor didn't speak much about her younger years, Margaret thought, her memories of her grandmother tinged with a newfound sense of mystery. Had she been trying to protect the past, or had she simply moved on, leaving this chapter of her life buried like the snow that blanketed the town each winter? Samuel broke the silence, his voice steady but laced with curiosity. I found a record of an event at Willowmere in the summer of 1946. It was some kind of garden party, formal by the looks of it. The Townsends hosted it just before the estate's financial troubles became public. Margaret leaned closer, her eyes scanning the page he had uncovered. The description was brief, little more than a list of attendees and a note about the lavish floral arrangements that had adorned the garden. Yet the date caught her attention. That's around the same time Avery mentioned Eleanor visiting, she said, her mind piecing together the timeline. Do you think she attended this event? Samuel's expression grew thoughtful. It's possible. If she was involved with Avery, it would make sense for her to have been there. We might find something in the local newspaper archives. Photos, perhaps, or an article about the party. The idea was enough to spur them into action. Together, they moved to the microfilm section of the library, where rows of spools containing decades of the Garland Cove Chronicle waited to be explored. Samuel operated the machine with practiced ease, loading the reels and scrolling through the pages that flickered on the screen. The summer of 1946 unfolded before them in black and white headlines and columns of dense text. Margaret's eyes scanned each page, her focus unwavering as she searched for any mention of Eleanor or the Townsends. It was a slow process, the minutes stretching into hours as the wind outside battered against the library's windows. Finally, Margaret's patience was rewarded. An article from mid-July caught her attention, its headline proclaiming, "Willowmere hosts summer gala amid rumors of decline." The accompanying photograph was grainy, but clear enough to capture the essence of the event. Guests in formal attire mingled in the garden, their expressions poised and elegant, their movements frozen in time. "There," she said, pointing to the screen. "That's Avery." Samuel adjusted the focus, and Avery Townsend's image sharpened. He stood apart from the crowd, his dark suit tailored impeccably, his gaze fixed on something, or someone, just outside the frame. "And look," Samuel added, his voice tinged with excitement. "Could that be Eleanor?" Margaret's breath caught as her eyes followed his gesture. A young woman stood near the edge of the frame, her face partially turned away but still discernible. Her dark hair was styled in soft waves, and her dress, though simple, carried an air of understated elegance. "It has to be her," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. She felt a surge of emotion, excitement, sadness, and a bittersweet longing she couldn't quite place. This was her grandmother, captured in a moment she had never imagined, standing amidst the fading grandeur of Willowmere. But the photograph raised more questions than it answered. Who had taken it? And why had it ended up buried in the archives of the local newspaper, forgotten until now? Samuel leaned back, his expression contemplative. If Eleanor was there, and if she and Avery were as close as the journal suggests, then their relationship must have been known to others. There could be more, letters, stories, something that ties them together beyond this one event. Margaret nodded, though her thoughts were already racing ahead. The photograph felt like a breadcrumb leading them deeper into the mystery, but it also hinted at a story that had been deliberately obscured. As they continued searching the archives, another article caught Samuel's attention. This one was dated late September, a few weeks after the journal's final entry about Eleanor. The headline was stark: Willowmere to be auctioned amid financial woes. The accompanying text described the Townsend family's fall from grace, their once vast fortune eroded by mismanagement and changing times. Willowmere House, the crown jewel of their estate, was to be sold to cover debts, its treasures scattered to the highest bidder. Margaret felt a pang of sadness as she read. The house she had visited only days ago, with its broken windows and crumbling walls, had once been a symbol of prosperity and hope. Now it stood as a monument to lost dreams, its history intertwined with her grandmother's in ways she was only beginning to understand. Samuel's voice broke into her thoughts. This confirms the timeline. If Eleanor left Garland Cove, it might have been around the time Willowmere fell into disrepair. But that still doesn't explain the letter, or why she kept it all these years. Margaret closed her eyes, the weight of the past pressing against her. The answers felt tantalizingly close, yet still just out of reach. "We need to dig deeper," she said finally. "Not just into Avery's life, but into Eleanor's. There has to be more. Something we're missing." Samuel nodded, his resolve matching hers. The wind outside seemed to echo their determination, its voice rising and falling like the whispers of those who had come before them. Together, they packed up their findings and left the library, the journal and photographs safely tucked away. The snow had begun to fall again, soft and steady, blanketing Garland Cove in a pristine silence. As Margaret walked alongside Samuel, her thoughts turned to her grandmother, to the woman she was now seeing in a new light. Eleanor had lived a life filled with complexities and secrets, a life that had somehow led to this moment, decades later, with Margaret standing at the crossroads of the past and the present. The journey was far from over, but with each step, the story grew clearer, its echoes resonating through the winter wind. Chapter 9. The Ink That Lingers. The first snowstorm of December had arrived in Garland Cove, turning the town into a whitewashed wonderland. From her window, Margaret watched the swirling snowflakes as they danced through the air, their delicate forms lost in the gusts of wind. The town had taken on a dreamlike quality, the streets eerily quiet under the blanket of snow. The world felt both distant and intimate, as if time itself had slowed in reverence for the season. Inside her small apartment, Margaret sat at her desk, surrounded by the remnants of their investigation. The journal, the newspaper clippings, and the photograph were all spread out before her, a puzzle of memories waiting to be solved. She had not expected to be this deep into the mystery, but the pull of the past was impossible to resist. Every new discovery only deepened her sense of urgency, as though Eleanor's secrets were demanding to be uncovered. Her mind drifted back to that moment in the library, when Samuel had pointed out the photograph of the garden party at Willowmere. The image of Eleanor had haunted her, its ghostly presence a reminder of a life Margaret had never known. Her grandmother had once been a young woman full of potential, full of hope. Yet somehow, that hope had been extinguished, lost to the years. Margaret picked up the journal again, her fingers tracing the delicate script. Avery Townsend's words still echoed in her mind, each entry imbued with a longing and a sadness that spoke across the decades. But what had happened to him after Eleanor had left? The letters, the journal, and the photo all suggested a love that had been left unfulfilled. And yet, there had to be more. Something that tied them together. Something that could explain why Eleanor had kept the letter all these years. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Startled, Margaret stood and made her way to answer it. When she opened the door, Samuel was standing in the doorway, a thick scarf wrapped around his neck and his cheeks rosy from the cold. "Did I interrupt something?" he asked with a smile, though his eyes were serious, scanning the piles of papers and books scattered around the room. "No," Margaret replied, stepping aside to let him in. "I was just going over everything again. It feels like we're so close, but I can't quite put it all together." Samuel nodded, his gaze lingering on the journal before he took a seat at the small table in the corner of the room. "I've been thinking about that letter. The one from Eleanor's attic." Margaret joined him, sitting across from him. "What about it?" "I was wondering if we're missing something important about its context," Samuel said, his tone thoughtful. "It's not just the letter itself. It's the fact that she kept it all these years hidden away. If she had truly wanted to forget Avery, she could have discarded it, but she didn't. She kept it. That says something." Margaret nodded, her fingers tapping lightly on the edge of her desk. "Maybe she never really got over him. It's possible. But there's also the possibility that she couldn't move on from something else," Samuel continued, his eyes fixed on the journal. "What if the letter isn't just a symbol of lost love? What if it's a reminder of something she had to let go of, something that was never fully realized?" Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "Do you think she was hiding the truth about their relationship?" Samuel looked up, his eyes locking with hers. "I think she might have been hiding more than just the love letter. Maybe there's more to Eleanor's story, something she didn't want anyone to know." A shiver ran down Margaret's spine. The thought that her grandmother might have carried a secret so profound, so deeply buried, was unsettling. But at the same time, it made perfect sense. Eleanor had always been a woman of grace and poise, her past tucked away behind layers of propriety. It was only now, in the wake of her death, that the cracks in that facade were beginning to show. What if we're looking in the wrong places? Margaret mused aloud. Maybe we're too focused on Avery. What if Eleanor's story isn't just about him? What if there's something more? Something she wasn't willing to share with anyone, not even her closest friends. Samuel leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he processed her words. "You think she might have been hiding something from everyone? Something that had nothing to do with Avery?" "I don't know," Margaret said slowly, "but I have a feeling we need to dig deeper into her life, beyond just her relationship with him." The room fell silent as the two of them exchanged a look, both sensing the weight of the new direction their investigation was taking. They had been focused on uncovering the truth of Eleanor's love story with Avery, but what if the real mystery lay elsewhere? What if there was a hidden chapter in Eleanor's life? One that had nothing to do with the garden parties or the lavish dinners at Willowmere. Margaret stood, her mind racing with possibilities. "I need to go back to her house. There's got to be something there. Maybe a letter or a diary entry. Something that can shed light on what really happened." Samuel hesitated, then nodded. "I'll come with you." The words felt heavier than they should have. Margaret knew that Samuel had his own reasons for being involved in this investigation, reasons he had yet to fully share. But it didn't matter. In that moment, they were united by something deeper than curiosity or obligation. They were bound by the search for the truth, no matter how elusive it seemed. As they left her apartment, the storm outside had grown fiercer, the wind now howling through the narrow streets. The snowflakes swirled in dizzying patterns, and the town seemed to be shrouded in an impenetrable fog. The world had grown quiet, but in that silence, Margaret felt the unmistakable pull of the past, its whispers calling to her from beyond the veil. The journey ahead was uncertain, but Margaret knew one thing for sure. Whatever secrets Eleanor had hidden, they were waiting to be found. And she, along with Samuel, was determined to uncover them, no matter the cost. Chapter 10. Beneath the Crimson Seal. The sky was a heavy, oppressive gray as Margaret and Samuel made their way toward Eleanor's house, the air thick with the promise of more snow. Garland Cove had always been a quiet town, but the storm seemed to have suspended time itself, casting a hushed stillness over everything. The streets, usually alive with the bustling of holiday preparations, were now eerily empty, save for the occasional figure bundled against the cold, hurrying toward shelter. As they approached Eleanor's house, the sight of the decaying estate struck Margaret with a familiar pang of sorrow. Willowmere had once been a beacon of elegance and wealth, a place where laughter had filled the halls and guests had roamed the lush gardens. Now, with its windows boarded up and the ivy creeping relentlessly across the crumbling stone walls, it seemed like a ghost of its former self. But for Margaret, it was more than just a building. It was the heart of the mystery she was now entangled in. She glanced over at Samuel, whose gaze was fixed on the house, his expression unreadable. He had been a part of Garland Cove's history for longer than she had, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, perhaps, or a lingering attachment that suggested his connection to the house went deeper than mere curiosity. "Are you sure we're ready for this?" Samuel asked, his voice low. "We've only just scratched the surface. There could be things in there. Things that might change everything." Margaret hesitated. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. But in her heart, she knew there was no turning back. If Eleanor had kept secrets, they were buried here, within these walls. And she wouldn't leave without finding them. "We don't have a choice," Margaret said finally. "We need to understand what happened. We need to know why she kept that letter, why she kept all of it." Samuel nodded slowly, his lips pressed into a thin line as he took a step forward, his boots crunching on the thick layer of snow. Margaret followed him, her heart beating faster as they crossed the threshold of the property, the smell of damp earth and decay filling the air. The front door creaked as Samuel pushed it open, the hinges protesting with a loud groan. Inside, the house was silent, the only sound their footsteps echoing off the wooden floors. The entryway, once grand and inviting, now stood in ruin. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, and the chandelier that had once adorned the ceiling now hung crooked, its crystals missing or broken. "We need to find the attic," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper as she led the way. The attic had been where she found the letter, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it held the key to everything. They made their way up the narrow staircase, the wooden steps groaning under their weight. Each step seemed to carry them deeper into the past, the house itself holding its breath as they ventured further into its forgotten corners. At the top of the stairs, Margaret paused, her hand resting on the banister as she looked around. The house seemed to hold its memories like a fragile treasure, each room telling its own story of time lost, of lives lived and forgotten. She could almost hear the faint laughter of Eleanor's youth, the rustle of silk gowns and the clink of fine china, all fading away like the snow outside. Samuel moved past her, his presence steady and reassuring, and they reached the door to the attic. Margaret's hand trembled as she grasped the cold brass handle, the familiar weight of uncertainty settling in her chest. She turned the handle, pushing the door open with a creak that seemed to reverberate through the silence. The attic was as Margaret remembered it, dimly lit by the weak light filtering through a small, dirty window. Dust hung in the air like a fog, settling over forgotten trunks and old furniture. It was as if the world had stopped turning in this room, its contents frozen in time. She moved cautiously across the floor, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of dust. Samuel followed closely behind, his gaze sweeping over the cluttered space. As they reached the corner where the trunk had been, Margaret felt a familiar pang of unease. The trunk was still there, just as she had left it, but now it seemed more than just an old piece of furniture. It was a threshold between the past and the present, a key to a mystery that had been locked away for decades. Margaret knelt beside the trunk, her fingers brushing the surface. The latch clicked open with surprising ease, revealing the contents inside. There were old photographs, yellowed letters, and pieces of clothing from a time long past. But amidst the clutter, her eyes were drawn to something else. A small, leather-bound book, its pages worn but intact. "Is this it?" Samuel asked, his voice low, almost reverent. Margaret didn't answer. Instead, she carefully picked up the book, the weight of it in her hands both heavy and fragile. She opened the first page, her eyes scanning the words written in Eleanor's elegant hand. It was a diary, but not the one she had expected. This wasn't a record of daily events or mundane thoughts. This was something far more personal. The entries were filled with longing, with emotion that Margaret hadn't known her grandmother capable of expressing. It was as if Eleanor had poured her heart into these pages, leaving behind a record of her truest, most private self. Samuel crouched down beside her, peering at the open page. "What does it say?" he asked. Margaret didn't answer at first. She was too caught up in the words, too drawn into the emotions that had been buried within this book for so long. It was as if Eleanor had never intended for anyone to read these thoughts, these confessions. But now, Margaret felt a profound connection to the woman she had never fully understood. "I think," Margaret said slowly, her voice shaking slightly, "I think this is where the story really begins." They sat in silence, the weight of the diary's revelations sinking in. There was no turning back now. The answers they had been searching for were here, hidden in Eleanor's own hand. And as the snow continued to fall outside, Margaret realized that the truth was finally within reach. Chapter 11. A Trail of Snowflakes. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting a warm, flickering glow across the room. The attic was eerily quiet now, save for the rustle of pages as Margaret continued to read Eleanor's diary. Each entry felt like a breath from the past, as though the woman who had once filled these pages was sitting beside her, sharing her most intimate thoughts. The weight of those words settled over Margaret like a blanket, a mixture of awe and dread. The secrets she had uncovered were slowly unraveling, and with each revelation, her connection to Eleanor grew more profound, more personal. She turned the page, the leather of the diary warm beneath her fingertips. The next entry was dated in the early spring of 1942. Margaret's eyes skimmed over the neat handwriting, her heart beating faster as she read. April 3rd, 1942. "I have finally made my decision. Avery will never understand, but I cannot remain in a place where my heart is not free. I must go. I must find a life where I can be my own, unencumbered by the promises made when I was too young to know better. There is a life waiting for me elsewhere, far from here, where I can be the woman I was always meant to be. But to leave him, to leave this life behind, is the hardest thing I have ever done." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The words were so raw, so filled with grief, that it was as if Eleanor had poured all of her soul into that single paragraph. She had made a choice, a painful choice, and it had cost her dearly. But what had she left behind? What had she been forced to sacrifice? The question gnawed at Margaret's mind, and she couldn't help but wonder whether Avery had ever truly known why Eleanor had gone. Samuel, who had been reading over her shoulder in silence, shifted slightly. His voice broke the stillness, soft but steady. "She loved him, didn't she?" Margaret nodded without looking up, the ache in her chest intensifying. "She did, but she also had to leave him. And I think that's why she kept everything, because she couldn't forget him, not completely. But she couldn't go back either." Samuel leaned back, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "There's something else here, though. Something more than just a lost love. You can feel it in her words. It's not just about him. There's a bigger reason she chose to walk away." Margaret stared at the diary, the weight of Samuel's words sinking in. He was right. It wasn't just about Avery, or the love they had shared. There was a deeper current running through Eleanor's words, something she had never fully expressed. The mention of needing to be free, to find a life where she could be herself. Those were words that spoke of a longing for something far beyond romance. "I think she was escaping something," Margaret said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Something she couldn't even put into words. Samuel's gaze met hers, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "You think it was more than just Avery?" Margaret hesitated, her fingers resting on the page. "Yes, I think there was more to Eleanor's story than we ever realized, more than anyone knew. And I think it's here, in this house, buried beneath everything she left behind." They both fell into a contemplative silence. The storm outside had intensified, the howling wind rattling the windows and the thick snow blurring the view. It was as though the world had been swallowed by the tempest, and all that remained was this small, forgotten room, where the past lingered like a heavy shadow. Samuel broke the silence again, his voice laced with an unspoken question. "What do we do next?" Margaret closed the diary gently, her fingers lingering on the worn leather cover. She had come here seeking answers, but what she had found had raised more questions than it had resolved. Eleanor had been running from something. But what? And why had she kept so much of her past hidden? "I need to go through the rest of the house," Margaret said finally. "There has to be more letters, photographs, anything that can shed light on what she was running from." "I'm sure of it." Samuel nodded, his expression serious. "We're not leaving until we find the truth." Margaret looked up at him, the weight of his words resonating with her. It wasn't just about uncovering Eleanor's secrets anymore. It was about understanding why those secrets had remained hidden for so long. And perhaps, just as importantly, it was about understanding what they meant for her own life, and the choices she was beginning to make in the present. The pull of the past had become so strong that it was hard to tell where it ended and the present began. Margaret felt as though she were standing at the edge of something vast and uncharted, a place where the past and future collided in ways she hadn't anticipated. They left the attic in silence, the diary still heavy in Margaret's hands, and moved through the house together. Every step they took seemed to echo in the empty halls, as though the house itself was guiding them, urging them forward into the unknown. As they entered the old study, a cold draft swept through the room, and Margaret's eyes were drawn to the large wooden desk in the corner. It was covered in dust, but something about it caught her attention. A small drawer slightly ajar, as though it had been disturbed recently. Without a word, she moved toward the desk, her heart racing in anticipation. She pulled open the drawer, her breath catching as she found what she was looking for. A stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon. These weren't the love letters she had already seen. These were different, old, yellowed, and fragile. She could feel the weight of history in her hands as she untied the ribbon and began to sift through the letters, each one more revealing than the last. There was a quiet sense of urgency building within her. With each letter, she felt closer to understanding Eleanor's decision, closer to the truth. And with each discovery, the silence that had once enveloped this house seemed to grow heavier, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. What had Eleanor been hiding? Margaret knew that the answers were in her hands now, waiting to be uncovered. And as the storm raged outside, she couldn't help but wonder if she was finally on the cusp of finding the truth that had eluded her for so long. Chapter 12. The Past Unfolds. The snow outside had intensified, blanketing the world in a thick, suffocating silence. The house seemed to grow colder with each passing minute, the crackling fire offering little comfort against the chill that seemed to seep into the very bones of the building. Margaret sat by the hearth, the letters she had found spread out before her like pieces of an intricate puzzle, waiting to be assembled. Samuel stood nearby, his expression unreadable as he stared out the window, lost in thought. The storm outside raged with an almost eerie intensity, the wind howling like some forgotten spirit, pushing against the walls of the house as though it too were trying to uncover the secrets hidden within. But inside, Margaret remained focused on the task at hand. The letters, old, yellowed with age, were more than just pieces of correspondence. They were fragments of a past that had been carefully hidden, a past that Margaret now realized she had only begun to understand. She picked up the first letter, the writing still legible despite the years. It was dated 1941, just a year before Eleanor had made her decision to leave. Margaret's eyes traced the familiar loops and curves of Eleanor's handwriting, her heart racing as she read the opening lines. "My dearest Eleanor, you are the only thing that gives me peace in this ever-turbulent world. With every passing day, I feel the weight of my duty pressing down upon me. The war has taken everything from us, and yet I find myself torn between my duty to this country and my duty to you. But I cannot bring myself to ask you to wait, for how could you wait for a man who may never return?" Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she read those words. She had known about the war, of course. It had been a part of Eleanor's life, just as it had been for so many others during that time. But to read about its impact, to see how it had shaped the choices Eleanor had made, was something Margaret had never fully grasped. She could almost feel the weight of those words, the uncertainty and fear that had gripped Eleanor's heart as she faced a world that seemed to be unraveling. Samuel moved closer, his eyes drawn to the letter in Margaret's hands. He didn't speak, but his presence beside her felt like a quiet reassurance, as if he too understood the gravity of the moment. Margaret turned the page, her eyes scanning the next letter. It was dated several months later, in the fall of 1942. The tone had shifted. There was a certain desperation in Eleanor's words now, a sense of urgency that hadn't been there before. "My dearest Eleanor, I write to you now with a heart torn between two worlds. The war is closing in, and the future seems more uncertain than ever. I do not know how much longer I can endure this life of separation, this life of endless waiting, but I cannot ask you to wait any longer. It is better that we part now, before I am lost to you forever. You must go on, Eleanor. You must find your own path, your own happiness. And I must find mine, even if it means leaving everything behind." Margaret's fingers trembled as she set the letter down. The finality in those words struck her like a physical blow. Eleanor hadn't just been torn between duty and love. She had been making a choice to survive, to preserve whatever part of herself she could in the face of overwhelming loss. The war had taken so much from so many people, but it had also shaped their decisions in ways that were not always visible, not always easy to understand. Samuel's voice broke the silence. "You're beginning to see it, aren't you?" Margaret looked up at him, her gaze distant. She wasn't just running from Avery. She was running from everything. From a life she couldn't control, from a future that had been stolen from her. She thought she had to leave everything behind, including the man she loved. Samuel nodded, his eyes dark with understanding. "It wasn't just the war, though, was it? There's something more, something Eleanor couldn't bring herself to say." Margaret's gaze shifted back to the letters. There was something she hadn't yet found, something hidden between the lines. The words spoke of love and duty, of separation and loss, but they didn't explain the full picture. Eleanor had made her choice, but what had she been running from beyond the war? As Margaret continued to read, her mind began to piece together a different story. A story of a woman trapped in a world of expectations, a world where love had to be sacrificed for survival. Eleanor's pain was not just the pain of lost love. It was the pain of a woman who had been forced to give up her own dreams, her own future, for the sake of those around her. And in that realization, Margaret found herself standing at the edge of a precipice, staring into the unknown. She had come to this house looking for answers about her grandmother's past, but what she was uncovering was something far greater. Eleanor's story was not just a story of love lost. It was a story of survival, of sacrifice, of a woman who had fought to maintain her sense of self in a world that demanded everything from her. But what did this mean for Margaret? She had been so focused on uncovering the secrets of the past, on understanding Eleanor's decisions, that she hadn't stopped to consider the implications for her own life. The choices Eleanor had made, the paths she had walked, were not just echoes from the past. They were part of a larger pattern, one that Margaret now saw reflected in her own life. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor as she moved toward the window. The storm outside had reached its peak, the wind howling like a beast. But inside, in the quiet of the room, Margaret felt a deep sense of clarity begin to settle over her. She couldn't keep living her life on the edge of uncertainty, couldn't keep clinging to a future that wasn't hers to control. Eleanor had made her choice, and now it was time for Margaret to make hers. "Do you ever feel like the past is something that's always chasing you?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the sound of the storm. Samuel didn't answer at first, but she could feel his presence beside her, steady and grounded. "Yes," he said after a long pause. "But the past doesn't have to define you. It doesn't have to hold you back." Margaret nodded slowly, her fingers gripping the windowsill as she gazed out into the swirling snow. The storm outside was fierce, but inside, she felt a quiet resolve beginning to take root. The past had shaped her, yes, but it was not all she was. She could make her own choices, walk her own path, just as Eleanor had done all those years ago. The storm outside might have been relentless, but inside, in that room filled with the weight of history and memory, Margaret knew that she was no longer bound by the past. She had the power to move forward. And with that realization, the storm seemed a little less fierce, the weight of the world a little less heavy. Chapter 13. Hearts Entwined by Time. The following morning, the house was still shrouded in the thick blanket of snow that had descended overnight, turning the world outside into an untouched canvas of white. The air was crisp and fresh, carrying the scent of pine and earth, as though nature itself had paused to observe the quiet tension that hung over the house. Inside, the warmth of the hearth seemed to fight against the chill that had settled into Margaret's bones, a coldness that had little to do with the weather and everything to do with the uncertainty that still lingered in her heart. Margaret stood at the window, gazing out over the snow-covered yard, her breath fogging the glass. She hadn't been able to sleep much the night before, her mind too full of the discoveries she had made in Eleanor's letters. The weight of the past, the choices Eleanor had made, felt heavier than ever now, and yet Margaret knew she couldn't leave it behind. She had to understand, not only for Eleanor's sake, but for her own. She had told herself that once she uncovered the truth, once she pieced together the fragments of Eleanor's life, she could walk away. But as the morning light filtered through the snow, she realized how much she had underestimated the pull of the past. It wasn't just about Eleanor anymore. It was about Margaret herself, about the choices she had yet to make, the life she had yet to claim. Samuel had left early that morning, saying he needed to visit the town's archives, but Margaret hadn't felt the urgency to follow him. There were moments when being alone with her thoughts felt like the only way she could process everything. The silence in the house seemed almost sacred, as though it allowed her to hear her own heart beating, to recognize the quiet stirrings of emotions she had long ignored. But the stillness also had a way of amplifying what was unspoken. The events of the last few days had shifted something between her and Samuel. She could feel it, could sense the subtle change in the air when they were in the same room. The way their conversations had grown more pointed, more laden with meaning. It was as if they were no longer simply two people trying to uncover the past together, They had become intertwined in a way that neither of them had anticipated. Margaret turned away from the window and walked over to the table where the letters still lay scattered. She picked one up, the ink faded but still legible, the words etched in Eleanor's unmistakable hand. She had been reading the letters for hours, trying to make sense of the complex emotions Eleanor had poured into each one, but it was clear that there were still many pieces missing. Her eyes scanned the page, and then her gaze landed on the next letter in the stack. It was a letter she hadn't read yet, one that had been tucked between two others, almost as though it had been hidden on purpose. Margaret's pulse quickened as she unfolded the fragile paper. The date on the letter was the same as the last one she had read, early 1942, but the tone was entirely different. "Eleanor, I can no longer keep this secret from you. The truth is, I have made a decision that will change everything. Avery and I, we were never meant to be. But there is someone else, someone who has captured my heart in ways I cannot explain. I know this will hurt you, and for that, I am truly sorry. But I must follow my heart, just as you followed yours." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Eleanor had loved someone else. The revelation was both a relief and a crushing blow. It explained so much, the pain in her letters, the sense of duty and sacrifice. But it also left Margaret with more questions. Who had Eleanor loved? And why had she chosen to hide it from everyone, including Avery? The silence in the room deepened, and Margaret sat down heavily in the chair beside the table, the letter trembling in her hands. 1,000 thoughts rushed through her mind, each one colliding with the next. Eleanor had left Avery, had made a choice that had torn her apart, and yet she had never revealed the truth of why she had done so. It was as if Eleanor had been trying to protect something, perhaps even herself, from the consequences of that love. But why? Margaret wasn't sure how much longer she could keep going down this path. She wanted answers, yes, but she also felt a strange sense of foreboding, as though the deeper she dug, the more she risked losing herself in the process. The past had a way of consuming everything in its path, and Margaret was beginning to fear that it would consume her, too. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a knock at the door. She hesitated for a moment, then pushed herself to her feet. She knew who it was before she even opened the door. Samuel stood on the other side, his face pale from the cold and his eyes shadowed with something Margaret couldn't quite place. He hadn't said much when he left earlier, but there was something in his expression now that made her uneasy. "Margaret," he said, his voice low. "We need to talk." Margaret nodded, stepping aside to allow him in. "What's happened?" she asked, though she already had a sinking feeling in her stomach. Samuel walked into the room, his boots leaving wet prints on the hardwood floor. He didn't sit down, but instead moved toward the window, his back to her as he stared out at the snow. The silence between them stretched out, thick and uncomfortable, until Samuel finally spoke. "I found something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something that changes everything." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She moved closer, her breath shallow. "What is it?" He turned to face her, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "The last letter Eleanor wrote, it wasn't to Avery. It was to someone else. Someone we didn't know about." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced, and for the first time in days, she felt the weight of the past become too much to bear. She had come here looking for answers, but what if those answers only led to more questions? What if, in uncovering the truth, she was only digging herself deeper into a history she wasn't sure she could escape? Samuel stepped closer, his voice barely a whisper. "Margaret, I think we've uncovered something that we weren't meant to know." And in that moment, Margaret realized that the past was no longer just a shadow hanging over them. It had become a force that threatened to pull them both under, into the unknown depths of a history they might never fully understand. Chapter 14. The Storm Within. The storm outside had turned from a flurry into a blizzard, as if the heavens themselves were echoing the turmoil that now churned within Margaret. The weight of Samuel's words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding, and she felt as though the house, once a sanctuary, had become a suffocating prison. The snow piled up outside, erasing all traces of the world beyond, while inside, the past threatened to unearth something that would change everything. Samuel's revelation that Eleanor's last letter had not been written to Avery had shattered the fragile peace that Margaret had carefully built over the past week. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in, pushing her closer to the edge of some unknown precipice. Every corner of the room seemed filled with the echoes of that truth, vibrating in the space between them, unspoken but undeniable. Margaret tried to process the words, but they slipped through her thoughts like water through her fingers. A letter to someone else? Someone they hadn't known about? She had spent days poring over Eleanor's letters, convinced that she understood the story, convinced that she had unearthed the secrets that lay buried beneath decades of silence. But this new discovery, the thought that Eleanor had kept another love hidden, threw everything into doubt. She turned her gaze toward Samuel, standing across from her, his face unreadable. He had been searching through the archives at the local historical society when he found the letter. He'd been silent for much of the day, a fact that hadn't gone unnoticed by Margaret. She could tell that something had shifted in him, just as it had shifted in her. There was a tension between them now, an unspoken awareness that the journey they had embarked on had irrevocably altered their paths. "I don't understand," Margaret said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't sure if she was speaking to Samuel or to herself. Why didn't she tell anyone? Why did she keep this hidden? Samuel sighed, his gaze distant, his shoulders slumped with the weight of the knowledge he carried. "I don't know, Margaret, but I think she was protecting someone. Maybe even herself." Margaret felt a pang in her chest, a sharp twist of longing and confusion. Eleanor had lived a life that had been defined by secrets, by sacrifices made in silence. But who had she loved? And why had she chosen to leave them behind, to bury her feelings beneath layers of duty and obligation? She turned back to the stack of letters on the table, the delicate paper now feeling more like a burden than a window into the past. Each letter she touched felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of all the unanswered questions was beginning to crush her under its pressure. Samuel moved toward her, his footsteps soft against the wooden floor, but Margaret didn't turn to face him. She couldn't. Not yet. She was afraid that if she looked at him, if she allowed herself to meet his eyes, the distance between them would grow even wider, and she wasn't sure she could bear that. "The letter," Samuel said, his voice softer now, as though he sensed her internal struggle. "It's not just a letter, Margaret. It's a confession, a revelation." She finally turned to face him, her expression a mixture of frustration and sadness. "What do you mean?" He looked at her, his brow furrowed, as if trying to piece together a puzzle that didn't quite fit. "I think Eleanor was in love with someone else, someone who wasn't Avery, but the letter doesn't say who. And the timing, it's all wrong. She was already leaving by then, already making her decision to go. So why write this letter? Why reveal something that seemed to have no bearing on the choices she had made?" Margaret shook her head slowly, her mind racing. "We need to know who it was, Samuel. We have to understand the whole story." But Samuel was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the fire that crackled in the hearth. "I don't know if we can," he said, his voice tinged with a sorrow that made Margaret's heart ache. "Some things, some truths, are buried so deep that they can never be fully uncovered." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She had come here to find answers, to uncover the mystery of her grandmother's past. But what if the answers she sought weren't meant to be found? What if some things were better left untouched, sealed away in the past where they couldn't hurt anyone anymore? She looked down at the letters, the pages fluttering slightly in the draft that had begun to creep through the cracks in the old house. The past was calling to her, but what if it was a call she wasn't ready to answer? "Samuel," she said, her voice trembling, "what if we can't handle what we find?" He looked at her, his gaze softening, though his expression was still weighed down by the gravity of their situation. "I don't know, Margaret, but I think we owe it to Eleanor and to ourselves to try." The words hung between them like a fragile thread, an invisible connection that seemed to stretch across the room. Margaret felt the pull of that thread, tugging her toward a future she wasn't sure she was ready for. It was a future that was no longer just about uncovering the truth of the past. It was about confronting her own fears, her own doubts, and the painful realization that the past had a way of shaping the present, whether she was ready for it or not. The silence between them deepened, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was an understanding, an unspoken recognition that they were in this together. Margaret couldn't have said what she expected to find in the letters or in Samuel's quiet presence, but there was something undeniable about the way their paths had converged. They were tied to the past in ways they hadn't anticipated, but they were also bound by something else, a shared sense of longing, of wanting to know the truth, even if it hurt. Samuel stepped closer, his voice steady as he spoke again. "We have to finish this, Margaret. We have to find out who she was really in love with, because I think this is the key to understanding everything." Margaret nodded, though a knot tightened in her chest. "But what if the key unlocks something we can't close again?" He didn't answer right away, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. He didn't know, either. But somehow, Margaret knew that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. Chapter 15. A Season for Answers. The snowstorm had not abated. In fact, as the days passed, it seemed to grow more relentless. The skies heavy with dark clouds, the wind howling through the trees like a living thing. Inside the house, the fire crackled merrily in the hearth, but Margaret felt the chill of the storm deep in her bones, a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. She hadn't spoken much since Samuel had shared his discovery about Eleanor's final letter. Each word he had spoken that day had only deepened her sense of unease, unraveling the comfortable certainty she had held for so long. The house, which had once seemed so full of life and warmth, now felt oppressive. Its walls too close, the silence too thick. The air itself seemed to hum with the weight of secrets, of truths waiting to be uncovered. Margaret sat at the small writing desk in the corner of the living room, her fingers hovering over the pages of the letters that still lay scattered before her. They had pored over every one of them, trying to piece together the story Eleanor had kept hidden. And yet, despite their best efforts, they were no closer to understanding the full extent of her grandmother's past. The new letter had only raised more questions, and as the storm raged outside, Margaret found herself wondering if some mysteries were simply meant to remain unsolved. Her eyes fell on the letter Samuel had found, the one Eleanor had written to someone whose identity remained a shadow. She had read it over and over, but still, the name of the person Eleanor had loved, the one who had captured her heart before she left for good, remained a mystery. Why had Eleanor chosen to keep her love a secret? Was it out of fear, shame, or something else entirely? Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were slipping further and further away from her grasp, like water seeping through her fingers. The wind outside howled louder, rattling the window panes as the storm worsened. Margaret pushed herself away from the desk, the chair creaking beneath her, and walked toward the window. The world beyond was an indistinct blur of white, the snow swirling in chaotic patterns, erasing everything in its path. It was as though nature itself had decided to bury the town beneath a veil of forgetfulness, to erase every trace of the past. to leave only the present in its wake. And yet, the past refused to be buried. Margaret turned away from the window, her gaze drifting to the corner of the room, where the fireplace flickered in the dim light. The crackling fire seemed almost too warm in contrast to the cold that had settled in her chest. She had come here seeking answers, and yet the more she uncovered, the more she was confronted with the fragments of a life she couldn't fully understand. Her mind drifted back to Samuel, to the strange tension that had developed between them in recent days. It was as though their shared search for the truth had only drawn them closer, and yet, at the same time, it had created a chasm between them, a chasm that neither of them knew how to bridge. Margaret had seen the way Samuel looked at her when they were alone together, the way his eyes seemed to linger just a moment longer than necessary, as if searching for something. And she had felt it too, that unspoken connection, the magnetic pull between them that neither of them seemed able to resist. But what did it mean? She didn't know. And yet, the more time she spent in his presence, the more she found herself drawn to him. Not just as a colleague, not just as the local historian helping her uncover her grandmother's past, but as someone who seemed to understand her in ways no one else did. There was a quiet intensity to Samuel that both unnerved and comforted her. His presence was a constant, but it was also a mystery, just like the past they were trying to uncover. Margaret knew that they were both on the edge of something, standing on the precipice of a revelation that could change everything. But what if that revelation wasn't just about Eleanor's past? What if it was about them, about the strange, unexpected bond that had formed between them? She couldn't help but wonder if the past had a way of pulling people together, of weaving lives into patterns that were only visible long after the threads had been crossed. What if Samuel's place in her life, in this story, had always been fated? A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts, the sound sharp and insistent against the quiet of the house. Margaret's heart skipped a beat as she turned toward the door. She hadn't been expecting anyone, certainly not in the middle of a snowstorm that had buried the world outside in isolation. She crossed the room, her footsteps muffled by the thick rug, and opened the door cautiously. Samuel stood on the other side, his coat dusted with snow, his face drawn with exhaustion. His eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "I think we're missing something," he said without preamble, his voice rough from the cold. Margaret raised an eyebrow, unsure of what he meant. "What do you mean?" He stepped inside, shaking off the snow and closing the door behind him. "I've been thinking about the letters," he said, his voice quiet, almost reverent. "About what we're not seeing." Margaret stepped aside, allowing him to enter. "Go on," she urged, her curiosity piqued. Samuel moved to the table where the letters lay, his eyes scanning them with a focused intensity. The timing of Eleanor's decision to leave, her choice to hide this letter, it's all connected to something bigger. "I've been looking at the dates, the circumstances, and I think I've found something we overlooked." Margaret watched as he sifted through the papers, his fingers brushing over the edges of each letter as though they held the key to some grand mystery. There was something almost reverent in the way he handled them, as though he could feel the weight of the past pressing down on him, just as it had been pressing down on her. He stopped suddenly, his gaze fixed on one particular letter. "This one," he said, pointing to a letter near the bottom of the stack. "It's the one that doesn't fit." Margaret felt a surge of anticipation, her heart beating faster as she approached him. "What do you mean?" Samuel looked up at her, his expression tight with something unreadable. "I think this is the letter that holds the answer, the one that tells us everything we need to know." Margaret felt a shiver run down her spine. This was it, the moment they had been building toward, the moment when everything would finally make sense. But even as she reached for the letter, a part of her wondered if they were ready for what they would find. The past had a way of casting long shadows, and Margaret wasn't sure whether the light of truth would be enough to banish them. Chapter 16. The letter's final word. The letter in Samuel's hand felt different. It wasn't just the weight of the paper or the curl of the ink that set it apart. It was the way the air around them seemed to shift the moment he lifted it. Margaret watched, her heart pounding in her chest as Samuel slowly unfurled the page, the rustling sound filling the silence that had stretched between them. The fire in the hearth crackled softly in the background, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill that had descended on the room. She stood frozen in place, her breath caught in her throat, as though the world outside had disappeared entirely. There was only this moment, this single breath that hung suspended in time. As Samuel's fingers traced the edges of the letter with careful reverence, the anticipation in the room was palpable, and Margaret couldn't help but feel as though she were standing at the edge of some great precipice, looking down into the unknown. "What does it say?" she asked, the question barely a whisper, her voice carrying more weight than she intended. Samuel didn't immediately respond, his eyes focused on the words in front of him. He seemed to be lost in the letter, his gaze intense, as if searching for something deeper than the words themselves, something that could explain the riddle of Eleanor's past, something that could untangle the threads of this mystery they had been chasing for so long. When he finally looked up at her, his eyes were filled with an emotion she couldn't quite place. It was a mixture of awe, sorrow, and something else, something that felt almost like fear. "Margaret," he began, his voice unsteady, "I think we've found what we were looking for. But it's not what we expected." Her heart skipped a beat, and she felt an ache in her chest, as though the very air had thickened, becoming heavier with every passing second. She walked toward him, her feet dragging, as if the weight of the moment were holding her back. "What do you mean?" she asked again, more insistent this time. Samuel placed the letter on the table between them, carefully smoothing out the edges as though it were fragile, something that could crumble if handled too roughly. He pushed it toward her, and Margaret hesitated for only a moment before she took it into her hands. The letter was addressed to no one in particular, but the words were unmistakable in their clarity. "My dearest, there are truths that remain unspoken, not because they are less important, but because they are far too heavy to carry alone. I find myself standing at the crossroads of a life I've chosen to leave behind, and a future I can't yet see. There is someone who waits for me, someone who is a part of me in ways I can't fully explain, but who must remain a shadow in my life for now. He knows my heart, even though I've never told him what it truly holds." The letter goes on to describe a love that had never been fully realized, a connection between Eleanor and a man who, it seemed, had always been just out of reach. The name was never mentioned, but Margaret could feel the weight of the words, the pain of a love unspoken, of a relationship held back by the hands of time, by circumstances beyond their control. The more she read, the more the pieces of Eleanor's life began to fall into place, and yet, with each revelation, the mystery only deepened. "I knew it," Samuel muttered under his breath, his hand resting lightly on the table. This man, whoever he was everything to her. And yet, she never could be with him. She couldn't break free from her past, from her responsibilities. Margaret's hands shook as she continued reading, but the words blurred as a tear slipped down her cheek. She wiped it away hastily, ashamed to be so vulnerable in front of Samuel, but she couldn't help it. The sadness in Eleanor's words, the raw emotion in every line, had touched a place deep within her, a place she hadn't known existed until now. This was more than just a historical mystery, more than a search for answers about the past. This was a story of longing, of missed opportunities, of love that had been left to wither in silence. Margaret could feel the weight of it in her chest, a tightening that made it difficult to breathe. "I never realized," she whispered, barely able to form the words. I never knew she loved him so much." Samuel was silent for a moment, his gaze distant, as though he, too, was feeling the enormity of what they had uncovered. She loved him more than she ever let on, Margaret. But it wasn't just about love, it was about choices. About a life she couldn't change. Margaret nodded slowly, feeling a strange sort of kinship with Eleanor in that moment. She, too, had faced decisions that had been out of her control, moments in her own life when love had been overshadowed by duty, by expectations, by the demands of the world around her. As she looked up from the letter, she met Samuel's gaze, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that was unmistakable, a recognition, an understanding of what they had both uncovered, not just about Eleanor, but about themselves. There was a vulnerability there, a quiet admission of something that neither of them had dared to confront before. In the silence that followed, Margaret realized that the story of Eleanor's past was more than just a collection of old letters. It was a mirror of their own journey, of the choices they had made, the paths they had taken, and the love that had always been just beyond their reach. As the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in a soft, undisturbed silence, Margaret felt the fog of uncertainty begin to lift. It was as though the truth, though painful and incomplete, had finally begun to carve a path through the darkness. She didn't know what lay ahead. She couldn't possibly know. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of clarity, of possibility. The letter had answered some questions, but it had also raised new ones. It had revealed a love that had never been fully realized, a connection that had always been just out of reach. And yet, as Margaret looked at Samuel, she wondered if that was exactly how things were meant to be. Sometimes, the truth didn't offer all the answers. Sometimes, it only pointed the way forward, leaving the rest to be discovered on the journey ahead. As the storm outside finally began to ease, the world beyond the windows slowly coming back into focus, Margaret made a decision. She would not be content with the past. She would not be content with only half of the story. She would find the answers, not just for Eleanor, but for herself as well. And perhaps, just perhaps, the journey toward those answers would be the most unexpected part of all. Chapter 17. Love Across the Years. The morning after the storm arrived with a quiet stillness that seemed to pause time itself. The world outside had transformed into a glistening, snow-covered wonderland, the sun's weak rays struggling to break through the thin veil of clouds. But for Margaret, the world had changed in a way she couldn't yet fully comprehend. The discoveries of the past days had revealed a truth she had never anticipated, and now, as she looked out the window, she wondered how it would reshape her future. The letter had been more than just a key to Eleanor's past. It had opened the door to her own heart, to the unspoken desires and fears she had kept locked away for so long. What had begun as a search for answers had turned into something much more intimate, a journey not just through time, but through her own soul. She sat by the window, the cold glass pressing against her palm, looking at the delicate beauty of the snowflakes drifting down, settling on the world like a soft blanket. The storm had passed, but it had left behind something more profound than just a blanket of snow. It had left a quiet clarity in its wake, a sense of resolution that had been absent before. And that clarity, Margaret realized, had everything to do with Samuel. The fire in the hearth crackled behind her, its warmth barely reaching the place where she sat. But the warmth she felt within herself was enough to chase away the lingering chill. Samuel's presence had become as constant as the snow, an undeniable force quietly shaping her world in ways she hadn't expected. Their shared discovery had drawn them closer, yes, but it had also forced her to confront her own feelings, her own long-buried hopes and fears. She had spent so many years building walls around her heart, convinced that love was a luxury she couldn't afford. a weakness she could never allow herself to embrace. But now, as she sat there, watching the world outside transform, she felt those walls beginning to crumble. The door to the living room creaked open, and Samuel stepped inside, his figure framed by the soft light from the hallway. The look in his eyes was one she couldn't quite place. Was it the same wonder and hesitation that mirrored her own, or something deeper, more certain? It was impossible to tell, but there was a quiet understanding between them now, an unspoken acknowledgement that the bond they shared had deepened beyond words. He didn't speak immediately, and neither did she. The silence between them had become something comfortable, something natural. Samuel walked over to the window, standing beside her, and they both stared out at the snow-covered landscape. "Do you think we'll ever really know what happened between Eleanor and him?" Samuel's voice broke the silence, his tone soft but filled with the weight of their shared journey. Margaret's gaze didn't leave the window as she answered, her voice a mere whisper. "I don't think we can ever fully know. Some stories are meant to remain unfinished, no matter how hard we try to write the ending." Her words held a strange truth to them, a wisdom she hadn't expected to find. She had spent so much time trying to understand the past, trying to piece together the fragments of Eleanor's life. But perhaps the real answer lay not in the details of what had been, but in accepting that the past had shaped them, without needing to know every single piece. "And yet," Samuel added, his voice closer now, as though he stood just behind her, "it feels like we've uncovered something important, not just about Eleanor, but about us." Margaret turned to look at him, her heart beating faster as their eyes met. There it was again, the connection, the understanding, the unspoken truth that had been growing between them. She had known it from the beginning, when they first began their search. But now, standing here, in the quiet aftermath of everything they had discovered, she felt it more than ever. The past had brought them together, yes, but it was the future, whatever it might hold, that called to her now. "Maybe we don't need all the answers," she said, her voice steady now. "Maybe it's enough just to know that we've shared this, that we've uncovered something together." The words lingered in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Samuel didn't answer right away, but his gaze softened, and in that moment, Margaret felt as though she had stepped into a new chapter of her life, one that she hadn't anticipated, but one that felt right. She could see it now, the possibilities that lay ahead, the paths they could walk together. "I think you're right," Samuel finally said, his voice quiet but firm. "Maybe some stories are meant to be left open, to be felt rather than understood." Margaret smiled, a small, knowing smile, as she turned back to the window. Outside, the snow continued to fall, a steady rhythm that matched the beat of her heart. It was as if the world was offering her a second chance, a chance to rewrite the story of her own life, to embrace what had always been there but hidden behind the walls she had built around herself. "I think," she said softly, "that we've both been writing our own stories for a long time. Maybe it's time to start writing one together." Samuel's hand reached out, his fingers brushing against hers, the warmth of his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes, about trust, about the future, and about the love that had slowly blossomed between them, like the first fragile bloom of spring after a long, cold winter. Together, they stood there by the window, watching the snow fall, the world outside a quiet blur, as the fire crackled behind them. The past, with all its mysteries and unanswered questions, had led them to this moment. And now, as they faced the future, Margaret realized that maybe the greatest mystery of all wasn't the story of Eleanor's past, but the story that was yet to be written, a story they would write together.